One of the things that I find most distressing, if you like, about the attitudes of the world in general and the liberal intellectual class in particular is the way that you would imagine if you read the press or watched television news that we're living in a world that is totally bloody, basically. That we're living in a world that is on the brink of collapse and is basically going to the dogs at an incredibly rapid rate. When in fact, if you actually bother to look at the statistics, you soon realise that the world we're living in is better than it has been at any time in history. That by any objective standard, human beings are living better, living longer, having a more varied and flourishing life than has ever been the case at any time before. And all sorts of statistics can be readily and easily dug up to show this. My own favourite one is that according to the United Nations' own statistics, at the moment 1 person in 5 on the planet gets by on an income of less than $1 a day, which is the UN's definition of absolute poverty. But according to the UN and the OECD's estimates, in 1820, 85% of the world's population was living on an inflation-adjusted equivalent of $1 per day. So in just over 180 years, we've gone from 85% of the world's population living in a condition of abject poverty to 20%. Not only that, but again, according to the United Nations' own statistics, since 1990, in the last 17 years, the proportion of the world's population living in that condition has gone down from 28% to just over 20%. And it's heading in the right direction at an extremely rapid rate. So we've had, in fact, the biggest decline in poverty in the whole history of the world in just the last 17 years in terms of absolute numbers. Now, you'd never imagine this. You would never realise this if you were to get your view of the world from the popular mass media or from the ramblings of various intellectuals. And one of the reasons for this is, I think, systematic misunderstanding of trade and of globalisation and the growth of the world economy. And the kind of idiot pop stars that Richard mentioned, this is one of their favourite subjects. And a constant theme is the idea that in fact trade, or at least trade as it exists, is something which is bad, which makes people worse off, and which is inherently exploitative. An idea which is so incredibly untrue that one hardly knows where to start, particularly if, like me, you come from Manchester. And there's a number of basic faults or flaws, basically, which I am constantly made aware of. One of them is there's a fundamental lack of knowledge about the history of trade and globalisation. And this is something which I'm constantly struck by. One of the most persistent notions is the idea that what we call globalisation is something completely new and novel that it only really began in about 1990. Well, in fact, this is completely untrue, because when you unpack it, what we mean by globalisation is simply increased economic integration. It just means that people are more closely connected and the level of economic integration has reached a new level. The point is, there's nothing new about this. This has been going on for, in fact, 5,000 years. You can trace this process, not necessarily always in the same direction, as there have been a couple of periods in history, notably the 6th and the 7th century and also the 14th century, roughly 1320 to 1450, where the trend was in the wrong direction, if you like, where economic integration actually went down, where the world definitely became less economically connected than it had been before. But overall, over the long course of events, you can see that the trend is very much for globalisation to occur. And historians often talk about the first globalisation of the 19th century, and we forget just how huge a breakthrough there was at that time. People talk today about the enormous impact of things like the internet, satellite communications, the mobile phone. Well, I submit that that's nothing compared to the impact, say, of the telegraph, where for the first time in human history ever it was possible to communicate over thousands of miles instantaneously. Just imagine how much of a transformation that actually was. Or the impact upon world trade and world movement of people of the creation of the iron-hulled steamship, which amongst other things meant, by the way, that you no longer had a 1 in 4 chance of a ship going across the Atlantic sinking. So that was the actual ratio before then. So if you embarked on a ship for the New World in the 17th or the 18th or the early 19th century, it really was a case of prey, because you had a 1 in 4 chance that the ship wouldn't make it to the other side. Of course, you wouldn't either. So the iron-hulled ship had a huge impact there. But in fact, even that wasn't really the first globalisation. You can make an equal case for a globalisation during the Renaissance, with the creation for the first time of long-distance sea routes around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Pacific, and the creation of a world economy built ultimately on New World silver, something I'll come back to in a moment. Another problem I'm constantly struck by is that there's a basic misunderstanding of what trade is. people do not really understand how wide a category trade is and how it describes much more than the kind of relationships or exchanges that people usually associate with this term. And I think that one of the sort of basic exercises I'm going to take you to is designed to make people think more about what in fact they mean by trade and also what it's not. And finally, I have to say that there's been a negative impact of a whole lot of modern economic thinking, including by some Nobel Prize winners. In particular, I think that the impact of the Heckscher-Ohlin model of trade has been very bad, and that this has led partly to what Richard alluded to, the notion of fair trade, which has become a pervasive sort of influence in a lot of popular discourse. Now, what I've got here is a series of exercises which I'm going to go through now. These are essentially examples of how we can try to teach trade and how you can try to explore some of the issues that trade and the history of trade and its development raise. And since we've got a lot of people from the education business here, I've gone and done the education speak bit and talked about learning outcomes. Sorry for that. This is normally something I don't approve of, but I thought I might as well do it there. So as you'll see at the start, there are 5 basic kind of outcomes that this kind of activity is meant to put across. Understanding what trade is, in other words, addressing one of the problems I've mentioned. Having a clear understanding of what kind of human relationship trade is and how it's different from other kinds of human relationships, both relationships like friendship, familial relations, some of the social capital relationships that you heard about in the last session, but above all how it's different from relations that involve power and the actual or implicit use of coercion and the threat of force. And also how trade is different from other kinds of exchange relations, such as gift giving or tribute, or at least arguably so, because that's one of the interesting questions in fact. An understanding of how trade appears and develops historically, knowledge of the main features of the historical development and organisation of the world's trade system, which I'll talk about at the end here, and an understanding about the basic ideas behind the economic analysis of trade and the way economists thinking about this has changed. And what I mean here is particularly the change from the classic Ricardian theory of trade, which I think is still basically the best way of thinking about it, although as I will argue, Ricardo's own analysis has a kind of basic flaw in it. And an understanding in particular about what international trade actually is, what this word means. You'll notice I've written quotes, and I think the reasons for that will become apparent. So the first thing is a kind of activity to try and get people, maybe students, maybe others, to think about what trade actually is. And basically it's a scenario-driven exercise in which you can use handouts or group discussion or role play perhaps. And what you do is, first of all, you give the participants a whole list of possible interactions or exchanges or relations. And what they have to think about is identify which ones are trade-based or involve trade, and if so, why. And this should lead them to then say, well, what is it these ones we identify as being trade-based have in common? And then, if you look at the other ones you define as being not trade-based, are they all the same, or can you in fact subdivide it? And I've given examples of the kind of interactions or relations you could use. Purchase for a product or service, like buying the newspaper, which John mentioned in his talk. Selling something on eBay. This is something which many people are familiar with these days, and I think it's a wonderful thing, eBay, not least because it's introduced huge numbers of ordinary people to what trade and commerce is actually like. It does have the drawback for me, though, that whenever I go to a post office to post anything, I always have to queue up for ages behind somebody who's posting about 80 identical packages through the post, quite clearly because they're selling something on eBay. An exchange or swap of goods, where instead of buying something with money, you give one kind of good for another, maybe in exchange. Now, when people have gone through this, what they should be able to come up with is the following points. They should first of all realise straightforwardly, seems obvious but many people don't grasp this apparently, that there has to be more than one person involved for something to be a trade. There's, in other words, an activity like working on your own garden may create wealth, but it doesn't involve trade, because trade necessarily means two people. And at the core of trade, the thing that defines what trade is that at least two people exchange things, that one thing, which may be money, maybe an object of some kind, is exchanged for something else, another object, a service, something of value. The exchange has to be voluntary. So I would expect people to say, for example, that the robbery is not trade, and that the payment of protection money is not trade, because the person who is making part of the transaction, part of the deal, is not doing so on a voluntary basis. They are doing so because they've literally or metaphorically had a gun held to their head. both parties gain from the exchange, or feel that they gain. It's important that that is something you mentioned. So it's not an exchange relation that involves force, or where one party is worse off by their own evaluation than they were before the exchange taking place. Money doesn't have to be involved. It's perfectly possible to have trade without money, but it often is involved. The parties to the exchange don't have to physically meet or even know each other, particularly when money is involved. eBay, for example, makes that point very clearly. Now the second thing is really the core of this set of things. It's a game. This game is originally invented by Vernon Smith, who was at George Mason, just moved to Chapman in California, lucky fellow, so he's now going to be living near Santa Barbara. It was for work like this he was originally given the Nobel Prize a few years ago. So basically the way this game works is as follows. Each participant is given a bag, and the bag contains a range of goodies, you might say, various things, like pencils, rubbers, sweets, toothpaste, map, a whole range of things. You can make whatever it is. The ideal way of doing this, although this may be difficult, is to have no two bags exactly alike, but that's not necessary for the game to work. It's just that there has to be a sufficient degree of variation so that they're not all identical. And each person has to have a minimum number of different types of goodie, but some people can have more than others. That's perfectly possible as part of the game. Now, the first thing is everyone then has to look through the contents they've got and they have to say roughly how much they think it's worth to them. In other words, how much they would actually be prepared to pay for the contents of the bag that they've been given. And if they say nothing, or they pay not to have it, if, for example, you have an Andrew Lloyd Webber CD in there and you pay not to have it, then that's fine. So it's perfectly possible or appropriate for people to say they've got a bag with a negative value. So then what happens is this: people are sat down and they're then allowed to do swaps or exchanges, but only with the person sat on one side of them. So they can interact and make exchanges with one person only in the room. And you then sort of allow like discussion, negotiation, exchange to take place for a given amount of time. Then, after this has been done, you then have to say to the people, okay, after you've made the exchanges, or even if you haven't made the exchanges, what's the value of the contents of your bag now? And is it higher than it was before? And if so, can you roughly estimate by how much? It doesn't matter too much if they say, well, I can't really say, but I just know it's worth more to me. But usually people can roughly work out how much worth more it is. Then you have another round of exchange, except that this time you remove the restriction on only exchanging with the person who sat next to you, and instead you allow people to exchange the room, to get up, to walk around, to do all sorts of things like that. And after another period of time, you then have another assessment round, and people have to then, again, give an evaluation of how well off they are, how much the value it is. Now, when you do this, and then you get people together to see what gets out of this, the following things should happen. You should find, and this almost always works out, that everyone who takes part in an exchange feel themselves to be better off after they've taken part in the exchange. So the point is, there's been a net increase in the total value of the goods in the room, even though nothing new has actually been put into the pot. You've not actually put anything new into the sort of total amount of wealth, if you can call it that, that's there. But simply by virtue of people exchanging goods, the value, the subjective value of the goods in total has actually increased. Secondly, and this is a very important thing, what you should find generally is that the perceived increase in value is greater after the free exchange than it was after the more restricted one. Now, from this you can draw a number of conclusions, obviously. One of them is that trade increases value even without having production effects. Another is that the more people you can interact with, the more people you can exchange with, the fewer restrictions there are, the greater the increase in value is going to be. Because the more likely it is that you will find reciprocity or mutually advantageous trades. Now, what it also means is that a price system emerges, particularly when you get the second round, the more complicated round where people are allowed to trade with whoever they like. That's because what you find is that some of the goodies are more highly valued than others, and so you start to get emerging a pattern of rates of exchange for different kinds of goodies, basically. So you will tend to find, for example, that chocolate bars exchange at a very high rate of value compared to, say, tubes of toothpaste and things like And so you can quite clearly see the price schedule, a price system will actually emerge as a result of this process of exchange, which is another obvious thing to put across. Now there's a number of ways in which you can vary this game to explore other questions about trade. One of them is to have much more clearly unequal endowments at the start. So to say that to give some people much larger bags with much more goodies in them than other people have. And we're interested to see what you think would happen as a result of this. Another is to have more than one round of exchanges under the first rules, the rules under which you're not allowed to trade with anybody other than the person sat next to you. What you will find if you do this is that chains emerge in which, for example, I know that I want something that Chris has got, but I can't trade with her, I can only trade with Richard because he's the person sat next to me. So I basically said to Richard, okay, I will give you this thing that you want if you can then exchange something with Chris so that we can then pass on the thing that I want from her. So you'll start to see the emergence of chains of that sort. But what you'll also see is cases where a chain that would work like that breaks down because somebody in the middle of the potential chain either doesn't have the goods that people on the other side would want or is just an awkward swine and won't cooperate. If you have more than one round under the stage 2 rules, which is another variation, what you tend to find is that there's middlemen appear who engage in arbitrage. And also, the really interesting variation of this game is where you allow people to add to the original endowments by introducing new goods. And what that tends to lead to is a much more dynamic process in which the total value increases dramatically. And that is used to make the point that basically when we're talking about trade, what we're talking about is a dynamic relationship, one that doesn't just involve a fixed amount of goods being allocated maximally efficiently. We're talking rather about something which will actually lead to entrepreneurial activity, new things being created. You can also use this to test the evolution of money by having some widely dispersed goodie which people tend to accept and exchange all the time. As I say, chocolate is the one that usually emerges if following this role. Now, the next thing is something which I find both interesting but also testing when teaching my students, and that is explaining to them what comparative advantage is. Now, I have here for you a little handout which I use, which uses 2 products, fish and coconuts, and 2 people, 2 friends of mine, Don and Carol. And basically, it sets out the classic Ricardian model of how to explain comparative advantage on the basis of different opportunity cost ratios. Now, my experience when doing this is that the students are always completely blown away by this. It's something that they're just utterly dumbfounded. And their standard reactions are, first of all, that, well, it can't possibly be true. There's got to be a catch somewhere. Or that it's the most amazing thing they've ever come across. Or that I must have fixed the numbers somehow. I do try to explain to them that the only reason why the numbers I've used in this example are because I want to avoid having complicated ratios that you need a decimal fraction to explain. The only conditions under which there will not be a gain from trade in this scenario is where the opportunity cost ratios are the same for both of the parties. The people are not called Don and Carol, by the way. The much more efficient one, who's got the absolute advantage in both fish and coconuts, is called Ricardo, obviously alluding to David. But it's an extremely good one. And what you can then do is compare this to a different kind of trade game. Now there's 2 which I mention here. One is the international trade game, which is the one that's intended to show you how fair trade works. So you can get this from Oxfam. Another is a very good game actually, called the trade ruler game, which is where you're the ruler of a country. And this is intended to show how the Heckscher-Ohlin model of international trade works. Having done both, what you should then do is ask the people to compare the 2 games and the different assumptions that they have. And I've set out what the crucial differences are. And the key thing I think is that, first of all, the second game, the trade ruler game, basically, and also the Oxfam-based game, assumes that manufacturing is what matters. That essentially, if a country is to be rich, or people in a country to be rich, more precisely, they have somehow to be doing manufacturing. That you can't really do anything else. It's that matters. Also, that the units of analysis are countries, not individuals, which is what is the case in the first one. This then leads on to the next thing, which is a kind of thought experiment. The first thought experiment is that you have to ask people to work out how long it would take them to produce a product that they regularly use. Since I'm dealing with students, the product I usually use is a pint of beer. And it's quite a revealing experiment to work out how much time it would take you to produce beer a pint of beer, given that you're not allowed to, just so that you'll nip down to Tesco's and buy a home brew kit. You have to actually grow the grain, make the malt, create the wort, actually brew the beer. And people soon work out that they're going to have to spend like about 2.5 months in a year to produce 1 pint of beer. And you can perform this kind of exercise with many people and ask them to work out what kind of standard of living they would have if they were completely self-sufficient. It's then relatively easy to say, well, okay, suppose you're living in a village of 20 people, 50 people, and you're allowed to trade with the people in the village, but nobody else. Working on that basis, how long will it take to produce these various goods and how much money would you have? Then the second thought experiment looks at this from the other way around. What you have to do is you have to ask students to come up with reasons why the free importation or exportation of a good in or out of the UK is a bad thing and should not be allowed. And they typically come up with lots and lots of reasons. What you can then do is type these up, well, in fact usually you don't need to because you can predict what the arguments will be. But you give them back to them in a sheet which basically gives all the arguments they have, but the term United Kingdom is taken out and replaced by Manchester, or whatever you want, basically the unit you need. In other words, the point that should be then become apparent is that the arguments which apply for prohibiting import of goods into a country can be applied with equal force, and there's no reason why they shouldn't apply to importation into a smaller area, like a city, for example. So the question is, well, which you should then be able to raise, is, well, why is this? What is the difference, if any? Does it really make any difference? And then there's an adaptation of the earlier trade game, which, as you'll see, I've set out here. In one is where you have 2 rooms, and initially the group is in two groups in 2 rooms, and initially you don't allow any contact between the 2 groups, and then latterly you do. The other version is one where all the participants are in 1 room, but at some point during the phase where everyone is allowed to freely walk around and trade with everybody else, the game master, the person running the game, draws an arbitrary line and cuts the group up either into 2 or into smaller groups, and you're told that from that point onwards you can't trade with the people who are on the other side of this arbitrary line unless you pay a fee to one person in your own group who has been nominated by the game master as the person to control and regulate it. One of the things that comes from that is that when you do the evaluation, people will clearly find that they're less well off after that phase than they were when they were allowed to trade freely with everybody in the group at once. And they're asked how to apply this to current geopolitical controversies. There's also a couple of websites I've mentioned here, which capitalistinternational.org and mineconomy.com. These are actually, well, Mineconomy is a kind of second life website where you engage in virtual trade in a virtual world and various kinds of business activity. Capitalist International is actually a business site where you can engage in all sorts of trade, real life trade. You can just get involved in all sorts of commodity trading, import-export business, all that kind of stuff. And it gives you a very good idea of how the whole thing works. Finally, there's the question of how you actually look at the history of this. And the main resource, as I say here, is a series of maps. Now the main one comes from the Department of Archaeology at the University of Sheffield. What you have is a map of the planet, and it shows you trade routes. And when it starts off in 3000 BC, there are just 2 little trade routes, basically. One goes from southeast Anatolia, roughly southeast Turkey today, down to roughly where Basra is today. And the other one runs up the Nile from the Aswan to roughly the Nile Delta. And then gradually over time, more and more trade routes appear, more and more places become connected, and you can see that there's a long-term process in which more and more parts of the world are connected to more and more other parts of the world. And also, as this goes on, the lines on the map that represent the trade routes become thicker, indicating that the volume of trade transmitted over these routes has increased. One of the most important is the question about whether or not the pattern of trade that's described in these maps shows any kind of centre or periphery division. Because one of the constant themes in a lot of contemporary discussion of trade, at the very popular, simple level, is the idea that there's a kind of core part of the world which is essentially screwing and exploiting everybody else, the so-called periphery. Now, if this was so, you would expect to find it in the maps. And one of the questions is, well, is this what you find? I think the answer you'll find is, no, it's not. You do find, you might find something like that, arguably, although in fact I would say not even then, in a map which shows investment, but not otherwise.